Time is one of the most precious gifts God has given us. Yet it is also one of the most fleeting. Every day, every hour, every second is passing by, slipping through our fingers like grains of sand. We often live as if we have all the time in the world, postponing what truly matters, waiting for a better moment to step into our calling, to make things right, to follow God wholeheartedly. But my friends, the truth is, time is running out. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes 3:01 that to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. God has set appointed times for everything, and He is calling us to be aware of the season we are in. Some of you feel the weight of this truth in your spirit. You look around and see how fast life is moving, how quickly the world is changing, and you sense that something is shifting. That is not your imagination. God is stirring your heart, urging you to wake up and recognize that now is the time to draw close to Him. Now is the time to answer His call. Think about how many times we say, "I'll do it later." How often do we tell ourselves, "I'll pray more when life settles down," or "I'll start reading my Bible when I have more time"? But life never really slows down, does it? The demands of the world pull us in 1,000 directions, and before we know it, days turn into weeks, weeks turn into years, and we find ourselves looking back wondering where the time went. Jesus spoke about the urgency of time when He said in John 9:04, "As long as it is day, we must do the works of Him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work." This means that there is a window of opportunity. God has given us this moment, this season, to step into His. But there will come a time when that opportunity is no longer available. There will come a day when the doors of grace will close, and we will stand before God, giving an account for how we used the time He entrusted to us. Consider the people in the Bible who recognized the urgency of God's timing. Noah built the ark before the flood came. The Israelites left Egypt at the exact moment God commanded. Jesus Himself began His ministry at the appointed time, fulfilling every prophecy with perfect precision. They didn't delay. They didn't make excuses. They moved when God said move. And because of their obedience, they walked in the fullness of His promises. But what about those who ignored the urgency? What about the rich man in Luke 12:16-21, who stored up wealth for himself, planning to enjoy life, only for God to say, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you"? He thought he had plenty of time, but time had run out. My friends, we cannot afford to live as if we have endless tomorrows. God is speaking to us today. He is stirring hearts, calling His people to wake up, to rise up, and to take hold of the destiny He has placed before us. The question is, will we listen? Will we recognize that time is running out? Will we choose to follow Him now, or will we wait until it's too late? When God calls you, He isn't just inviting you to a better life. He is calling you to something greater, something eternal, something beyond anything you could imagine. But here's the truth. Answering His call requires obedience, and obedience requires action. Too many people hear God's voice but hesitate. They feel the nudge in their spirit, yet they wait, they question, they let fear hold them back. But when God calls, He expects a response. Think about the great men and women of faith. When God called Abraham, He told him to leave everything he knew, his home, his family, his country, and go to a land that God would show him. Abraham didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he trusted God enough to step forward. When Moses stood before the burning bush, he had a choice. He could have ignored it, stayed in the wilderness, and lived out the rest of his days in comfort. But he listened to God's voice, and because of his obedience, an entire nation was set free. My friends, God's call on your life isn't just for your benefit. It is for the people He has assigned you to reach. There are people who need the light of Christ in you, who need your testimony, who need to hear the words that God has placed in your heart. But if you keep delaying, if you keep waiting for a more convenient time, those opportunities will pass you by. We live in a world full of distractions. The enemy works tirelessly to keep us busy, to keep us entertained, to keep us focused on things that have no eternal value. Social media, television, endless responsibilities. All these things can pull us away from the voice of God. But the Bible warns us in Hebrews 3:15, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. Some of you have felt God's call for years. You've heard Him speak to your heart in the quiet moments. You've seen signs, felt convictions. But something has held you back. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's doubt. Maybe you don't feel qualified, or maybe you're afraid of what others will think. But let me remind you, when God calls you, He equips you. He doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Look at Peter. He was just a fisherman, an ordinary man. But when Jesus called him and said, "Follow me," Peter left everything and followed. And because of his obedience, he became a foundational leader in the early church. Look at David. He was just a shepherd boy, overlooked and underestimated. But when God called him, he stepped forward and he became a king. God is calling you too. He is calling you to step out of fear and into faith, to let go of excuses and trust in His plan. He is calling you to something greater, something that will impact lives, something that will bring glory to His name. But the question is, will you answer? Will you take that step, or will you let the moment pass? Time is running out and the call of God is urgent. Will you be ready? When God calls you to something greater, it is not just a gentle whisper. It is a stirring deep within your soul. It is the kind of call that won't let you rest, that keeps showing up in your dreams, that keeps pulling at your heart no matter how much you try to ignore it. But the truth is, many people ignore it. Many people hear God's voice but resist, because answering His call means stepping out of comfort and into the unknown. We are creatures of habit. We like security. We like knowing what's next. We like having control over our lives. But when God calls, He often asks us to let go of those comforts and trust Him. He asked Noah to build an ark before the rain ever started. He asked Esther to speak up for her people when she could have been killed. He asked Paul to spread the gospel even though it meant persecution. Over and over again, God has called people to step beyond what they could see, beyond what felt safe, beyond what made sense in the natural. You see, God's call isn't always convenient. It doesn't always come at a time when we feel ready. It doesn't wait for us to be fully prepared. Instead, God calls us in the midst of our insecurities, in the middle of our doubts, in the face of our fears. But He doesn't call us to do it alone. He calls us with His strength, with His wisdom, with His power. Think of Gideon. When God called him to lead the Israelites, Gideon didn't see himself as a warrior. He was hiding, filled with fear. He questioned God, doubted himself, and made excuses. But God didn't see Gideon as He saw himself. God saw the mighty warrior he was meant to be. And with God's power, Gideon led a small army to a miraculous victory. The same is true for you. God isn't looking at your limitations. He isn't focused on your fears or your past mistakes. He sees your potential. He sees the greater purpose inside of you. He sees what you were created to be, not just what you are right now. But in order for you to walk in that purpose, you have to trust Him. You have to believe that He is guiding you. You have to be willing to take the first step. even when you don't see the full picture. Some of you have been feeling this call for a long time, but fear has held you back. Maybe you've been telling yourself, I'll do it when I have more time. I'll do it when I have more resources. I'll do it when I feel ready. But let me tell you, there will never be a perfect time. If you wait for everything to be just right, you'll wait forever. That's why faith is required. That's why trust is necessary. God doesn't ask you to have all the answers. He asks you to be obedient. The enemy wants to keep you stuck in doubt. He wants to keep you busy with distractions. He wants you to second guess the call of God on your life. But don't let fear steal your purpose. Don't let uncertainty keep you from the great things God has planned for you. He is calling you to something greater. He is calling you to step out in faith. The question is, will you listen? Will you move when he says move? Or will you let the moment pass and wonder what could have been? When God calls you to something greater, there will always be obstacles. The moment you decide to follow his voice, the enemy will try to plant seeds of doubt, discouragement, and fear. Suddenly, the people around you may not understand your decision. You may face resistance from friends, family, or even your own heart. The enemy will whisper, are you sure this is the right path? Are you sure you heard God correctly? What if you fail? Look at Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he was full of excuses. I am not eloquent, he said. I am slow of speech. Moses saw his own shortcomings, but God saw his power working through Moses. And that is the same truth for you today. God doesn't call the perfect. He perfects the call. He doesn't ask if you are capable. He asks if you are willing. But the enemy will try to convince you that you're not ready, that you're not good enough, that you'll never succeed. He wants you to doubt yourself so much that you never take a step forward. He wants to keep you in a place of hesitation, questioning every move, delaying your purpose. But listen, when God calls you, he already knows the obstacles ahead. He knows the challenges. He knows the difficulties, and yet he still says go. Why? Because he is going before you. He is making a way where there seems to be no way. Consider David when he faced Goliath. Everyone around him doubted. Even King Saul, the leader of Israel, looked at David's youth and inexperience and thought he was unqualified. But David knew something they didn't. He knew that the battle was not his, but the Lord's. He knew that God had already prepared him for this moment. The battles he had fought in private, defeating lions and bears while tending his father's sheep, had been preparing him for something greater. And the same is true for you. The struggles you have faced, the hardships you have endured, the moments that felt like defeats, they have been preparing you for the calling God has placed on your life. Nothing has been wasted. Every tear, every trial, every challenge has been working together to build your faith, to strengthen your endurance, to equip you for the road ahead. But you have to make a choice. Will you let the fear of obstacles keep you from moving forward? Will you allow the doubts of others to define your destiny? Or will you trust that if God has called you, he will provide everything you need to fulfill that calling? The enemy will try to make you feel alone in your journey, but you are never alone. The same God who parted the Red Sea, the same God who shut the mouths of lions for Daniel, the same God who walked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, that same God is walking with you now. No obstacle is greater than God's purpose for your life. No obstacle can stand against his power. So when you face resistance, when the enemy tries to convince you that you can't do it, remind yourself of this. If God is for me, who can be against me? He has already given you the victory. Your only job is to step forward in faith. When God calls you to something greater, he is not calling you to a life of comfort, ease, or predictability. He is calling you to a life of faith, a life where you step into the unknown, trusting that he will provide everything you need along the way. Too often we wait for conditions to be perfect before we move. We say, Lord, I'll obey you when I have more money, when I feel more confident, when I have more support. But that's not how faith works. Faith is moving even when you don't have all the answers, even when you don't know how things will turn out. Abraham was called to leave his home, his family, and everything familiar to follow God to a land he had never seen. Didn't have a road map. He didn't have all the details. He only had God's promise, and that was enough. He moved forward in faith, trusting that God would fulfill his word. And because of that obedience, Abraham became the father of nations. Think about Peter when he saw Jesus walking on water. The storm was raging, the waves were crashing, and Jesus called him out of the boat. Peter could have stayed where it was safe, where it was familiar, where it made sense, but he chose faith. He stepped out onto the water, and for a moment he did the impossible. He walked on water because his eyes were fixed on Jesus. It was only when he looked at the wind and the waves that he started to sink. And that's what happens to us. God calls us to something greater, but instead of keeping our eyes on him, we focus on the obstacles. We focus on the what ifs. What if I fail? What if it's too hard? What if people don't support me? And the moment we allow fear to take over, we begin to sink. But just like Peter, Jesus is always there, reaching out his hand, ready to lift us up and get us back on course. God is calling you to step out of the boat. He is calling you to move forward in faith, not because the journey will be easy, but because he will be with you every step of the way. He doesn't want you to stay in a place of complacency, settling for a life that is less than what he created you for. He wants you to live in the fullness of his purpose, to experience his power working through you, to see the miracles that happen when you trust him completely. When you take that step of faith, the world may not understand. Some people will question your decisions. Others may try to talk you out of it. But remember this: God did not give them the vision he gave you. He did not place your calling in their hearts. He placed it in yours. And what he starts, he will finish. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to see the whole picture. You just have to trust the one who does. God's timing is perfect, and his plan is greater than anything you could ever imagine. If he is calling you, don't wait. Don't hesitate. Don't let fear hold you back. Step out in faith and watch as he does exceedingly abundantly more than you could ever ask or think. There is a stirring in your spirit, a whisper that won't go away, a feeling deep within that tells you that you were made for more. That is not your imagination. That is not a fleeting thought. That is the voice of God calling you higher, pulling you toward a purpose greater than you ever imagined. But with that calling comes a choice. Will you listen? Will you trust? Will you take the step of faith even when the path ahead is unclear? Throughout history, God has called ordinary men and women to do extraordinary things. Moses was tending sheep in the wilderness when God called him to lead an entire nation out of bondage. He didn't feel qualified. He had excuses. Lord, I'm not a good speaker. What if they don't believe me? But God wasn't looking for someone who had it all figured out. He was looking for someone who was willing to say yes. And when Moses obeyed, God parted the Red Sea, performed miracles, and changed the course of history. Maybe today you feel like Moses. Maybe you're looking at your weaknesses, your insecurities, your past mistakes, and you're thinking, surely God can't use me. But let me tell you, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. He is not asking you to have all the answers. He is not asking you to be perfect. He is simply asking you to trust him. Look at David. When the prophet Samuel came looking for the next king of Israel, David's own father didn't even consider him. He was out in the fields tending sheep, forgotten and overlooked. But God saw him. And when the time was right, God called him out and anointed him for something greater. He went from shepherd to king, not because of his status, but because of his heart. God saw something in David that no one else did. And he sees something in you too. You may feel overlooked. You may feel unqualified. You may feel like the least likely person to be chosen for something great. But God does not see you the way the world sees you. He sees beyond the surface. He sees the gifts, the strength, and the faith buried deep within you. And when he calls you, he is not looking at what you lack. He is looking at what he has placed inside of you. God's calling is not always comfortable. It will stretch you. It will take you beyond what you think you can handle. But that's the beauty of it. Because when you step out in faith, you're not walking in your own strength. You're walking in his. You're relying on his wisdom, his power, and his provision. And when you do that, you will see doors open that no man can shut. You will see opportunities you never expected. You will see miracles unfold before your very eyes. If God is calling you, it's because he has a plan for you. He sees something in you that is ready to be used for his glory. Don't ignore that calling. Don't dismiss it as wishful thinking. Don't wait until you feel fully prepared, because the truth is none of us are ever fully prepared. The step of faith comes first, and then God equips us along the way. He is waiting for your yes. Will you give it to him? The time is now. The weight of eternity presses upon each of us, urging us forward, calling us higher. God is not asking for your perfection. He is asking for your obedience. He is asking for your surrender. He is asking you to trust him more than you trust your fears, your doubts, and your uncertainties. You may not know what the future holds, but you can be certain of who holds the future. When God calls, he already knows the outcome. He has already gone before you, paving the way, removing obstacles, preparing divine appointments, and setting up miracles you cannot yet see. Think of the disciples. They were simple men, fishermen, tax collectors, men with no great reputation, no great wealth, no high status in society. Yet, when Jesus said, "Follow me," they left everything behind. They didn't know what lay ahead. They didn't know that they would witness the dead raised to life, the sick healed, the multitudes fed. They didn't know that through them the gospel would reach the ends of the earth. But they stepped out in faith, and God used them in ways beyond their imagination. And now God is calling you. He is calling you to step beyond what is comfortable, beyond what is familiar. He is calling you to trust him in the waiting, to believe even when you don't understand, to walk forward even when the road is unclear. The enemy will try to distract you. He will whisper that you're not good enough, that you're not ready, that you're not strong enough. But let me tell you something. God does not ask for strength because he is your strength. He does not ask for ability because he is your ability. All he asks for is your heart, your faith, and your willingness to say, "Here I am, Lord, use me." You don't have to know all the answers. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to trust the one who does. Because when you do, when you take that step of faith, when you say yes to God's calling, you step into a purpose greater than yourself. You step into the life you were created for. You step into the destiny that has been waiting for you all along. And when you do, you will see that God's plans are far greater, far more beautiful, and far more powerful than anything you could have ever imagined. The clock is ticking and time is running out. God is calling you to something greater, something beyond what your eyes can see and your mind can comprehend. This is not a call to wait. This is not a call to hesitate. This is a call to move, to rise, to step into the purpose He has placed before you. You may feel unprepared, you may feel unworthy, but God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. He takes the weak and makes them strong. He takes the broken and makes them whole. He takes the fearful and fills them with courage. And today He is calling you. The enemy wants you to stay where you are. He wants you trapped in doubt, in hesitation, in fear. But God is saying, come. Come into the life I have for you. Come into the purpose I created you for. Come into the destiny I designed before the foundations of the world. Will you answer? Will you say yes? Will you step forward in faith even when you cannot see the whole picture? Because the moment you do, the moment you surrender and trust, God will take you places you never imagined. He will open doors you never thought possible. He will bless you beyond measure. So, my friend, do not wait. Do not delay. Say yes to God today. Say yes to His purpose. Say yes to His plan. Because time is running out and eternity is waiting. The world needs you to rise, and God is calling you now. Will you answer?